Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to the Bible Difficulties and Answers podcast. I'm your host, Lance Smith, and this is episode 287, part two of our three-part investigation into one of the most significant objections raised by skeptics against Christianity. In part one, we agreed to do something that's becoming increasingly rare. Instead of answering an easy version of the skeptic's argument, we agreed to answer the strongest version. We saw that thoughtful critics such as Bart Ehrman and Tim O'Neill argue that Jesus genuinely expected the end of the age during the lifetime of his disciples. And because that didn't happen, they conclude Jesus was simply mistaken. We also discovered something surprising. The Skeptic's Annotated Bible actually understates the objection. Most serious critics don't base their argument on just Matthew 10:23 and Matthew 24:14. They point to an entire collection of passages that seem to speak of Christ's coming within the lifetime of his contemporaries. So today, we're finally going to examine the verse that sits at the center of that discussion, Matthew 10:23. Because before we can understand Matthew 24, we first have to understand Matthew 10. Let's begin by reading the verse again. Jesus says in Matthew 10:23 in the New Living Translation, "When you are persecuted in one town, flee to the next. I tell you the truth, the Son of Man will return before he have reached all the towns of Israel." If we simply read that verse by itself, I can understand why skeptics raise an eyebrow. It certainly sounds as though Jesus expected something significant to happen before the disciples completed their mission throughout Israel. But one of the first lessons every Bible student learns is this: context matters. Wayne Jackson begins his Christian Courier article, "What is the Meaning of Matthew 10:23?" by reminding readers that difficult passages should never be interpreted in isolation. We have to consider the immediate context, the language being used, and how Scripture uses similar expressions elsewhere. I appreciate that approach. Sometimes Christians are tempted to act as though every difficult passage has an obvious answer. Matthew 10:23 isn't one of those passages. Wayne Jackson opens his Christian Courier article by acknowledging that this is, quote, "one of the most difficult passages in the New Testament," unquote. I appreciate that honesty. If the faithful Bible students have wrestled with this passage for generations, we shouldn't be surprised that skeptics have questions about it too. That's not a weakness of Christianity, it's simply the reality of studying ancient texts carefully. So, let's begin where the context begins. Sean McGowan, in his excellent article, "Before the Son of Man Comes," Matthew 10:23, makes an observation that I think is incredibly important. He writes this: "The mission in Matthew 10 is not the Great Commission. It is a temporary mission to Israel during Jesus' earthly ministry." That one observation changes how we read the entire chapter. Suddenly, we're no longer reading Jesus' final instructions to the church. We're listening to very specific instructions given to the 12 at a particular moment in redemptive history. In verses 5 and 6, he tells them this: "Don't go to the Gentiles or the Samaritans, but only to the people of Israel, God's lost sheep." McGowan points out that this is a temporary mission directed specifically to Israel during Jesus' earthly ministry. In other words, this isn't the church's worldwide mission after the resurrection. It's an earlier assignment with a much narrower focus. That alone should make us cautious about importing later events into this passage. But then something interesting happens. As Jesus continues speaking, his instructions begin to stretch beyond that immediate mission. He starts talking about governors, kings, Gentiles, future persecution, families being divided, and enduring to the end. McGowan observes that Jesus seems to move seamlessly between the disciples' immediate mission and the future experiences of his followers after his resurrection. That helps explain why this passage has puzzled interpreters for centuries. Jesus is speaking about more than one horizon, At the same time, one of the things that makes biblical prophecy so challenging is that it sometimes has more than one horizon. An event can have an immediate fulfillment while also pointing forward to something greater. That's one reason prophecy can be difficult to interpret. Now, here's where things become especially interesting. What exactly did Jesus mean when he said, "The Son of Man will come"? Notice something. Jesus didn't simply say, "I will come." He deliberately used the title, "the Son of Man." That may not seem important at first. Not every evangelical scholar agrees on this point, and I think that's worth acknowledging. For example, Austin Brown, writing for Gentle Reformation, reaches a different conclusion. He argues that the phrase, "the Son of Man," should be understood against the backdrop of Daniel 7. Rather than pointing primarily to AD 70 or the Second Coming, Brown believes Jesus is referring to the inauguration of his kingdom through his death, resurrection, and ascension. Now, I don't ultimately land where Brown does, but I appreciate something in his approach. He asks an excellent question. Why did Jesus choose the title, "the Son of Man" here? That's exactly the kind of contextual observation that good Bible students should make. Rather than immediately jumping to conclusions, Brown begins by asking how Jesus himself normally used that title and how his first century audience would have understood it. That's careful interpretation. So, where do many evangelical scholars land? Wayne Jackson and Sean McGowan both conclude that the best explanation is that Jesus was referring to his coming in judgment upon Jerusalem in AD 70. That may sound surprising if you never heard it before, but it's actually rooted in a much broader biblical pattern. Throughout the Old Testament, God is frequently described as coming in judgment against nations. He comes against Egypt. He comes against Babylon. He comes against Edom. Those passages don't describe a visible appearance of God walking across the landscape. They describe God's intervention in history through acts of judgment. Jackson argues that Jesus is employing the Old Testament's well-established language of divine judgment. The destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 marked the climactic judgment upon the nation that had rejected her Messiah. That judgment occurred within the lifetime of Jesus' generation, just as he predicted elsewhere. Now, before we go any further, I want to make something clear. This is not the only evangelical interpretation, and I think that's important to acknowledge honestly. Some faithful scholars like Austin Brown connect Matthew 10:23 primarily to Christ's resurrection and the inauguration of the kingdom. Others understand the verse differently still. But here's the remarkable thing. None of those evangelical interpretations conclude that Jesus made a failed prophecy. They disagree about precisely which coming Jesus had in mind. They do not conclude that he simply got it wrong. And I think that's a distinction worth remembering. Now, whenever discussing prophecy, it helps to ask a simple question. Does this interpretation fit the rest of Scripture? Because if someone proposes an explanation that works beautifully in one verse but falls apart everywhere else, it's probably not the right explanation. That's one reason Wayne Jackson's argument deserves careful consideration. He points out that the Old Testament repeatedly uses coming language to describe God intervening in history through acts of judgment. Isaiah speaks of the Lord coming against Babylon. Ezekiel uses similar language concerning Egypt. Joel, Amos, Zephaniah, and other prophets announce the day of the Lord in ways that describe historical judgments while also foreshadowing Christ's ultimate judgment. In other words, divine comings aren't always visible appearances. Sometimes they describe God's sovereign intervention in history. If that's the prophetic language Jesus is using in Matthew 10, then his statement begins to make much more sense. David Guzik makes a similar observation in his commentary on Matthew. I appreciate his reminder that the Bible uses the language of Christ's coming in more than one sense. Sometimes it points to his final visible return. Other times it describes his coming in judgment upon a nation. That's not inventing a new interpretation to solve a problem. That's recognizing how prophetic language already functions throughout Scripture. But let's return to the skeptical argument for just a moment. Bart Ehrman argues that passages like Matthew 10:23 should be read naturally. In his view, Jesus expected God's climactic intervention within the lifetime of his own disciples. Since history continued, Ehrman concludes that Jesus simply got it wrong. Now, I appreciate Ehrman's willingness to deal honestly with difficult passages. I also agree with him on one point. We shouldn't explain away difficult texts just because they make us uncomfortable. But I think Ehrman makes an assumption that deserves to be examined. He assumes that every reference to Christ's coming refers to exactly the same event. And that's precisely the question under debate. If Matthew 10 is speaking about Christ coming in judgment, while another passage speaks about his visible return, then we're no longer talking about one failed prediction. We're talking about different events described with similar prophetic language. That's a very different discussion. David Bowen, writing for the Ehrman Project, makes an observation that I think is especially helpful. Instead of treating all of Jesus' prophetic statements as though they refer to one single event, Bowen examines them individually. He argues that Matthew 10:23 points to the judgment on Jerusalem. Matthew 16:28 is best understood in light of the transfiguration that immediately follows. Matthew 23:36 again points toward the coming judgment upon Jerusalem. Matthew 24 contains both near-term events, including Jerusalem's destruction, and Christ's future return. And Matthew 26 speaks of Christ's ultimate vindication and future glory. Bowen concludes with this: Jesus was not wrong about when he would return. He predicted a taste of judgment for the people of God within a generation of his death. He also predicted his visible return in glory. Whether you agree with every detail of Bowen's interpretation or not, I think that's an excellent summary of why many evangelical scholars reject the failed prophecy argument. You know what encouraged me most while researching this episode? None of these evangelical scholars ignored the difficult verse. None of them brushed the skeptic aside. They all took the objection seriously. They simply concluded the evidence pointed somewhere different. Now, let's step back for a moment. What have we discovered so far? First, Matthew 10 isn't the Great Commission. It's a temporary mission to Israel during Jesus' earthly ministry. Second, Jesus' instructions begin with that immediate mission, but gradually broaden to include future persecution that his followers would experience after his resurrection. And third, the phrase, "the Son of Man comes," has been understood in several different ways by faithful evangelical scholars. Some connect it with Christ's resurrection and ascension. Others understand it as referring to his coming in judgment upon Jerusalem in AD 70. Still others have proposed different explanations. But here's what struck me most as I worked through these articles. The disagreement isn't over whether Jesus told the truth. The disagreement is over which event Jesus had in mind. That's a very different conversation than the one often presented by skeptics. Sometimes you'll hear people say, Christians can't even agree on what the verse means. That's true to a point, but disagreement over interpretation isn't the same thing as admitting a contradiction. Think about it this way. Imagine 3 detectives arrive at the same crime scene. One thinks the suspect entered through the front door. Another believes he came through a window. A third suggests there was an accomplice. They may disagree about some details, but all 3 agree a crime actually occurred. Likewise, evangelical scholars may debate precisely how Matthew 10:23 should be understood, but none of them conclude Jesus made a failed prophecy. That's an important distinction. I think it's a fair one. So where does all this leave the Skeptic's Annotated Bible? Remember its original claim? Matthew 10 places Christ's coming before the disciples finish preaching throughout Israel. Matthew 24 places the end after the gospel reaches all nations. Therefore, contradiction. But after working through the arguments presented by Wayne Jackson, Sean McGowan, David Guzik, Austin Brown, and David Bowen, I don't think the issue is nearly that simple. Every one of those evangelical writers begins with the context. Every one of them recognizes that Matthew 10 is a difficult passage. Every one of them distinguishes between possible meanings of Christ's coming. And every one of them concludes the passage does not require Jesus to have made a failed prediction. But they all reject the skeptic's conclusion. And that brings us to one final question. Even if Matthew 10 isn't talking about Christ's final return, what about Matthew 24? Because that's where the Skeptic's Annotated Bible begins its comparison. Jesus says the gospel will be preached throughout the whole world. All nations will hear, and then the end will come. What exactly does he mean by the end? What does all nations mean? Does the whole world mean every corner of the globe or something else? And perhaps, most importantly, is Jesus still talking about the same event, or has the conversation shifted? That's exactly where we're headed next time. We'll open one of the most challenging chapters in the New Testament. We'll hear from D.A. Carson, Thomas Schreiner, and other respected scholars. And we'll discover why Matthew 24 has generated so much discussion among Christians for centuries. I think you'll find that the answer isn't nearly as simple as either skeptics or Christians sometimes make it sound. If today's episode helped answer a question you've wrestled with or gave you something you can share with someone who's skeptical about the Bible, I hope you'll pass it along to a friend. Word of mouth is still one of the best ways to help others discover this podcast, and I truly appreciate every recommendation. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so at buymeacoffee.com/Lance Smith. As always, it's appreciated but never expected. You'll find every episode at BibleDifficultiesAndAnswers.podbean.com. You can also find us on Facebook or email me anytime at BibleDifficultiesAndAnswers@gmail.com. I read every message and genuinely enjoy hearing from you. This is Lance Smith wishing you good health, good study, and God's richest blessings. We'll see you next time. So long, everybody.